When The Silence of the Lambs was released upon the world in 1991, it not only became a financial and critical success, but also the third film in history to win all 5 of the big awards at the Oscars, you knew it meant one thing: Tostitos pizza rolls. Because that's the best way to celebrate any achievement. No, it meant a sequel.
Everyone's gonna be happy.
Thank God it released in the 90s and not today. Forget a sequel, Disney would have purchased the rights and farmed out an entire cinematic universe. I can see it now. You've seen Hannibal Lecter behind bars, but have you ever seen him in the classroom? This summer on Disney Plus, it's Hannibal High. Why does it feel like that's a thing that would actually happen, and why is it so frightening? Anyways, A Silence of the Lambs sequel was destined to produce itself, but this was no ordinary follow-up. The Silence of the Lambs was based off an uber-popular novel by Thomas Harris, so any respectable sequel would need to follow the same path. The follow-up novel, however, would take 7 years to make its appearance in 1998, which, again, would be unheard of by today's sequel standards. The film would release only 2 years after that in 2001. Sounds like an easy production, which easily brought back the trio of Anthony Hopkins, Jodie Foster, and director Jonathan Demme to create a sequel that naturally feels like a successor to the original award-winning film, right?
Wrong.
Nothing would be the same. So, sit back, pop some pizza rolls in the microwave or oven if you're fancy. Personally, I think Lecter would be an oven guy. Pour yourself some Chianti and let's get into just WTF Happened to Hannibal.
This is really gonna hurt.
Originally, everything was in place just as you would imagine. It was expected that Jodie Foster would return to the character she cared so much about, and that Jonathan Demme would direct. The table was set. A bad choice of words. As I learned from the same place I get all my life lessons from, a Steven Seagal movie, assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups. The book was a bestseller with wild financial success that was met with middling reviews. Stephen King loved it, however, ranking it alongside The Exorcist as one of the scariest novels of all time. All this was good enough to convince producers Martha and Dino De Laurentiis to pay a whopping $10 million for the rights to adapt Hannibal into a film. That number may seem absolutely nuts, but the De Laurentiises had more skin in the game than a room full of Buffalo Bill dresses. You see, they produced the first ever Lambs franchise film in 1986 with Manhunter, an adaptation of Harris's first Lecter novel, Red Dragon, that he wasn't all that impressed with. So much so that he lent the rights to Orion to make The Silence of the Lambs for free, which also seems utterly insane until you hear Martha describe the choice, saying, quote, "We were afraid to make the movie. You could be terrible and say no, or you could demand money, which was kind of, why be greedy? Or you let them use it, and if it's successful, your asset has value," unquote. And it had value by the buttload. All this, and we haven't even mentioned a settled $25 million lawsuit they got into with Universal over the production of the sequel. The De Laurentiises were knee-deep and involved with this franchise since the beginning. They weren't about to walk away now. There was just one problem. The book they just purchased the rights to, while financially successful and Stephen King approved, was absolutely nuts.
You're crazy. I like you, but you're crazy.
The end of Thomas Harris's novel would take the beloved character of Clarice Starling, which Foster and Demme were understandably precious about, on a Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 level departure off the deep end. The book would ultimately end with Starling and Lecter as not only teammates, but lovers. That's right, lovers. In the book, they dined on Ray Liotta's prefrontal cortex together before Clarice revealed one of her breasts to Lecter, who, by the way, had spent a considerable amount of time using multiple versions of therapy to turn her into, wait for it, his long-lost sister, before the two ran off together and lived happily ever after, where they spent their days having sex, dancing, and learning new languages. That actually happened.
I'm not sure what to do with my hand.
Determined and $10 million lighter, the production pushed on and De Laurentiis was able to acquire Alien director Sir Ridley Scott himself to helm the project. In a hilarious exchange, Dino handed Scott the script for Hannibal while Scott was making Gladiator, which he immediately rejected, thinking it was about the historical figure and Carthaginian general, saying, quote, "Dino, I don't want to do elephants coming over the Alps. I'm doing a Roman movie now," end quote. They sorted out the confusion and the rest is history. Really weird history. Scott also thought that Harris's original ending was as baffling as the rest of us, saying, quote, "I couldn't take that quantum leap emotionally on behalf of Starling. Certainly on behalf of Hannibal. I'm sure that's been in the back of his mind for a number of years. But for Starling, no. I think one of the attractions about Starling to Hannibal is what a straight arrow she is," unquote. Harris was slightly open to the changing of his ending, but wanted to know what it would be. Though he was famously reclusive, they somehow got the writer to sit in a hotel room for 4 days with new screenplay writers David Mamet, who wrote Glengarry Glen Ross, and Steve Zalian, who would later write The Irishman, and hash everything out. And so, the film had gone out and got itself a new writer and director. At least they'd have the cast back, right? Right? Because you have to put the lotion in the basket, or you get the hose again. We were all about to get the hose again, and in a big way. That sounded weird. Jodie Foster, much like Demi before her, remained unpleased with the drastic changes to her character. She would ultimately walk away from the project, later saying, quote, "The official reason I didn't do Hannibal is I was doing another movie, Floor Plum. So, I get to say, in a nice, dignified way, that I wasn't available when that movie was being shot," unquote. Ouch. She would also say, quote, "Clarice meant so much to Jonathan and I know it sounds kind of strange to say, but there was no way that either of us could really trample on her," unquote.
Go on now.
Foster would say after watching the final product of the film she wasn't in, quote, "I saw Hannibal. I won't comment," end quote. Probably means she loved it so much she couldn't find the words, right?
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Then there's the other side of the story, which Dino De Laurentiis says is drastically different in a 2001 interview with The Guardian, saying that her agent said she wouldn't even read the script without an offer of $20 million. His alleged response, quote, "Give my love to Jodie Foster. Goodbye," end quote. And was happy about it, saying he, quote, "Didn't believe she was right from day one when I read the book," unquote. Regardless of the truth of the matter, the search for a new actress was on. After considering multiple actresses from Cate Blanchett to Angelina Jolie, landed on Assassins actress Julianne Moore. Moore was widely respected, and honestly a great choice to replace Jodie Foster. Unfortunately, it just wouldn't have felt right for the audience no matter who replaced Foster. Nevertheless, it's commendable that Moore had the guts to go in and give it her all. Anthony Hopkins, though said to be both hesitant and heartbroken when Foster wouldn't return, would be the polar opposite of difficult, and really, the actor equivalent of that friend who's always down to go out for a pint when you need a buddy. Hopkins hilariously said of his return, quote, "I thought, okay, fine. Let's see what it's like. I tend to be low-key about things like that," end quote. Later, they would ask him for his approval on Moore's casting, to which he replied, quote, "Oh yes, jolly good," end quote. "I just want to hug him. Is that weird?" He did later say about the project, however, quote, "I think it's a good film. The reservation I have about that idea, though, is that when Lecter is let out of his cell, he has no power. Because when he's confined in that cell, he's like a tarantula in a bottle. Once you let him out of that cell, there's nothing frightening about him," unquote. In the end, Lecter would feel quite less intense than he did in Lambs. Hopkins said he considered the character more mellow 10 years later, and, quote, "probably a much richer character," unquote. The character definitely felt a lot more refined with Scott and Hopkins diving headfirst into the cultured side of Lecter, all as he disemboweled detectives from rooftops and made chicken nuggies out of Ray Liotta's brain.
That smells great.
Speaking of Ray Liotta, the cast was rounded out most excellently with his hire as the resident FBI asshole who coined the term country pone in regard to female genitalia, whatever that means. Liotta was great in the film, as he was anything with his name attached to it and allegedly got the part because he kept running into Ridley Scott at the gym and one day asked if he had any parts for him. Hollywood is so weird. The title of biggest creep in the film didn't belong to Liotta's character or even Lecter himself. No, that title belonged to the character of Mason Verger, a rich pedophile who looks like Mitch McConnell went 10 rounds with prime Mike Tyson, was eaten by a T-Rex, and shat into a volcano. Underneath all those lovely layers of absolutely haunting makeup, which took 5 to 6 hours a day to apply, was Gary Oldman, though you might not have known it since he wasn't mentioned in any of the opening credits. To hear Martha De Laurentiis tell it, Oldman wanted top billing alongside Hopkins and Moore, but for a while left the project when he couldn't get it. He then returned and asked not to be credited at all for the project, likely realizing that it would create the sort of legend and mystique that actors dream of and Jonah Hill still can't attain no matter who he sells his soul to. Just kidding, Jonah. You know I love you. Interestingly enough, the part was originally offered to the great Christopher Reeve, who thought that maybe playing a disgusting and disfigured pedophile wouldn't be all that great for his image. Copy that, Superman. In one of the wildest and coolest stories of the film, Verger wants revenge on Hopkins for, making him look like a bag of milk had a threesome with a Five Nights at Freddy's animatronic and an old catcher's mitt. This after Lecter had come over and seduced him, gave him a few poppers, and then told him to literally cut off his own face. And he did it.
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
This leads Mason to concoct a wild plot to put Starling in danger so that Lecter will come for her, and then he can catch Lecter and feed him to a pack of wild boar that he keeps hanging around the farm like
sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
But the boars definitely made for some of the coolest horror effects in the film, with the crew buying a Russian boar head off of eBay and then using it for the close-ups or creating full-size human bodies made up of gelatin and stuffed with chicken and other assortments so that we, the audience, had the pleasure of seeing them believably and horrifyingly eat human beings. The crew outdid themselves, however, with the one scene you think about every time you think about Hannibal. It was a scene in which Lecter cuts chunks of Ray Liotta's brain out of his head as he's still lucid and cooks them on a skillet. For this scene, the crew had to create a full-scale model of Liotta to painstaking detail, and simultaneously shoot a version where Liotta himself sat in a chair with makeup. The result is unforgettable, and one of the most iconic horror scenes of all time, despite the overall reception to the film being quite murky. Hannibal debuted to the highest box office gross for a movie with an R rating on opening weekend, raking in $58 million. It went on to a worldwide total of $351 million overall. The film boasts a positive audience score on review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, but 39% Rotten Critics score, with one critic saying it has, quote, no tension, no rhythm, and no sense of purpose unless you count Helping Faces of Death fans feel more evolved, end quote. One must admit, the process of watching Hannibal is a strange one.
I think so.
The film in itself is a well-made Ridley Scott film with an interesting story and some great horror moments peppered throughout. It suffers from a bit of Halloween Ends-itis, however, as while one could argue it to be a good standalone movie, it is in many ways a poor follow-up to its predecessor. The tones of the two films just don't sync up well at all, especially when you add in the fact that despite her best efforts, it's just weird to have a different human being in the role of Clarice when Hannibal is still the same Hannibal. It's also a little hard to suspend belief that someone on the FBI's most wanted list and famed serial killer with such distinct physical traits It's just walking around in the open, giving lectures on art and sipping wine on restaurant patios. Even in the book, Lecter had undergone plastic surgery to make this all more believable. In the end, Hannibal crossed the finish line, made a whole bunch of money, and is quite an interesting watch, despite never truly feeling like the follow-up to The Silence of the Lambs. And that, my friends, is WTF Happened to Hannibal.